Oh yeah, I would
Yeah,
say it's very unlikely. I don't think it's
I
true.
think. Well, yeah, for me personally, I think because they are very dense. There's like a billion people.
Yeah, that's
Surely
crazy.
they would get more cases than other places.
You would think so. That's why it's weird. There's places like India. I would have expected to be a lot worse. They are crazy dense, and they have like a lot of poverty and stuff. But they haven't been too bad from what I've seen. Yeah, I don't know. It's been weird. All right, let's talk about disease control. So obviously, we have factors that spread the disease. So we talked about, things like international travel and, mutations of disease and a whole range of factors of why disease is spread. So how do we actually control disease? What are some of the things that we need to do to control? Okay, so we talked about causes of disease previously. We talked about, how diseases can spread, give rise to epidemics and pandemics, and they're quite deadly. um, we talked about the idea that a better understanding of disease and the causes and sanitation and healthcare practices can actually put us in a much better position. And these have allowed us to be fairly successful in controlling the spread of disease. Um, there are a range of risk factors. So if we have, wars or natural disasters, lack of food, lack of water, these can increase the risk of disease. And the World Health Organization are, the main governing body, are the ones that actually respond to these particular diseases. So at the moment, you know, yes, each country has their own, I guess, governing bodies, but the World Health Organization are really the ones that are overseeing this worldwide sort of pandemic, and they're the ones that are giving their, I guess, directives. Now, whether countries follow those directives is another matter, but they do give sort of worldwide directives, and they're the biggest sort of thing. So there's a few things that we can do to control disease, all right? And we're going to go through a few. The first thing is dependent, and again, it's all dependent on how the disease is transmitted. That's going to influence how we control it. Okay, so you would control a disease like AIDS different than you would control a disease like malaria, right? Because they're transmitted differently, so you control them differently. Okay, so something like malaria, which is spread via vectors, you would control by either killing off those vectors or controlling the spread of the vectors, right? Which makes sense. Okay, and there are a range of different vectors that we can identify as hosts in sort of the transmission of different sort of diseases. The housefly can spread a range of different bacteria and viruses that cause diarrhea. Mosquitoes spread things like malaria or dengue fever. Mites spread scabies. Fleas can spread the plague. Or animals tend to spread rabies, right? And these are all examples of different vectors that spread a range of different diseases. Okay, and if we want to try and control or prevent these diseases, we need to do something about the vectors because that's how it's spread. Okay, all right, so we can either undergo sanitation. So, how do we do this? So, we can eliminate or stop the breeding grounds for insects. Okay, so the main breeding ground for, say, mosquitoes is stagnant water, right? Water that is, not moving. Bad sanitation or bad water quality can be a really good breeding ground for mosquitoes. So if we can eliminate that breeding ground, all of a sudden, you're stopping the mosquitoes, and that's how malaria is going to spread, for example. Things like rats, it's simple things, cleaning practices, storing food properly. These are all things that we can do to prevent rats from breeding. All right, so that would potentially stop the spread of diseases that are spread by rats. Clean, fresh running water is a really big indicator, or way that we can control insects. Insects tend to thrive in water that is, less than sanitary. So sanitation, cleaning is a really big, easy way that we can control vectors and stop these from spreading. Yeah, we can trap barriers, things like insect repellents, okay, so or mesh screens in windows and doors, netting around beds. So if you go to anywhere that has issues with malaria, tropical regions, pretty much anywhere you sleep, you'll pretty much be sleeping under a mosquito net, essentially. And that's just how they do it because it's such a big issue, sleeping at night. So netting around beds is a big thing. You could put sort of, on waterways that are stagnant. Some places use layers of oil or kerosene on water to prevent, the larvae of mosquitoes growing. All right, you can use things like manual rat traps, ultraviolet traps for insects. Really, any way that you can trap or protect against these vectors is a really good way of potentially stopping, in the short term, the spread of disease. Okay, so you got to remember at this stage we're not talking about necessarily pandemics. They can be on small scale, and this can lead to sort of large scale stopping of these particular diseases. So if you have vectors, either sanitation or barriers or traps, things like insecticides, okay, so on a larger scale to kill off insects. These are, insecticides are pretty much any chemical used to kill insects. We have things like DDT, has a really non-chemical name. It's one of the first chemicals that we used as a pesticide. It was used back in like 1918, I think it came in, or something stupid, a long, long time ago. Malathion and pyrethrum, which is like Mortein. So we have like Mortein at home. That would be an example of like an insecticide. And we've used a lot of these since sort of World War II. Most of them are used as sort of aerosols, so any insecticide. And we can do this over a large scale or a small scale. But we have to be really careful with insecticides. They have a lot of environmental issues. This DDT one was found to be toxic to humans. They used it for quite a while. It's been banned. A lot of these aerosols, not very good for the environment. So we tend to be careful of their use. And what we do with them. We can actually use biological methods to reduce the spread of vectors. So a lot of these will actually involve manipulating the genetic or the DNA of insect species. So potentially we might select for sterile males, for example. We can introduce predators to vectors. So, for example, in some cases, we've introduced fish which can eat insects and larvae to help keep the numbers of mosquitoes in check and reduce the spreads of disease like malaria. So there are different weird biological methods. There was one, I don't know if we went through it. I think we may have. Where was it? It was in here that I want to just touch on. I'm not sure if we went through it before or whatever, but they did this thing in with dengue fever. They had a big issue with dengue fever, an outbreak, and the way that they actually stopped the spread of this particular dengue fever outbreak, or trying to, was they actually released other mosquitoes. So obviously mosquitoes can spread dengue fever. So what did they do? They had to find a way to stop these mosquitoes infecting other people. And so what they did was they actually got other mosquitoes which were infected with a certain bacteria. And this bacteria actually stopped the mosquitoes from being able to transmit the dengue fever virus. Okay, which is cool, yeah. So they found that, they did some research. They find that if a mosquito has this bacteria, it can't actually transmit the virus. So what did they do? They just released a whole bunch of these mosquitoes. They bred with other mosquitoes in the area. Obviously, well, there's obviously issues with it somehow. There's obviously there's obviously some issue. I'm not really sure why not, but there's something wrong with it. But yeah, and that stopped all outbreaks of this sort of dengue fever in northern Australia. For the last 4 years, they've essentially cut out dengue fever up in sort of the NT. And so these children in Townsville were actually part of the project. They helped release all these infected mosquitoes. And that's one way that they actually tried to curb or stop the spread. And that sort of biological method. And they've actually tried to mimic this to hopefully fight against the Zika virus as well in Brazil, because that's also spread sort of by mosquitoes. So they were going to trial that as well. And so that's one sort of interesting way that they've actually tried to fight different diseases. So there are multiple ways that we can do it. Biological ways is one particular way that we can do this. It is incredible, yeah. I think it's an amazing sort of interesting way, but that's only going to work against certain types of diseases, because not all diseases are spread by vectors. So if they're spread by vectors, we can do all these things. Trap. Remember, sanitation, trapping or creating barriers against the vectors, insecticides, or biological methods. So if it's spread by a vector, that's a good method. The second way that we can try and control disease is by killing the pathogens, all right? So obviously killing the pathogens is the best way. So first of all, antibiotics is a really good, that's a first line. We've talked about the fact that this was developed in like the 1920s by Fleming. It came from a mold which produced this penicillin, which is essentially a natural antibiotic. He realized that this particular mold was, destroyed the bacteria in his plate, and now we use that as an antibiotic. And that's a really easy, quick way of killing off bacteria. Okay, and there are a range of different antibiotics. They have a range of different modes of action. Okay, so they might interfere with different parts of the bacteria. Okay, so you might be, and dependent on the disease, you'll get given generally a different antibiotic. So some antibiotics work against some diseases, some don't. But really quick, easy way. Okay. Yep. So we said different antibiotics are different or not as effective against different bacteria. We talked about some of the risks, with antibiotic resistance, and how much of a risk that is. But that's a really quick way of killing off the pathogens. So we use that for bacterial infections. Even like we said, sanitation is a big thing. So things like antiseptics. So that'll kill microbes on the outsides of the body. Okay. What's the big thing now? Hand sanitizer, right? It's you barely get your hands on hand sanitizer now because it's being sold so much. Because it's a really quick way of killing off pathogens on the outsides of our body, right? Because if that's the way it spreads, okay, we got to try and kill those off. And so we use hand sanitizer a lot. All right. They've been used for 150 years, a long, long time. And most of them have some sort of alcohol base, some sort of iodine base, but antiseptics will kill things on the body. Disinfectants, similar to antiseptics, but that's for surfaces. So we use antiseptics on the skin. We use disinfectants on non-living surfaces to kill off microbes. But again, quick, easy way. Sanitation is a really quick thing, quick, easy to do. But killing off pathogens is one way that we can stop the spread. And these are just things that people do all the time. Make sure we wash our hands, make sure we clean down surfaces, use antibiotics if it's bacterial. We can see how this is being used at the moment. The third way, so we can either control the vectors, we kill off the pathogen, or if people are infected, we quarantine. That's the last sort of easiest way to do these things. So, and we can see that happening now. Remembering, quarantining is where we take infected people and we separate them from healthy members of the population. Okay, it's different than isolation. So isolation is where essentially healthy people stay away from the rest of the population. That would be isolation. Okay, quarantining is where you take infected people and remove them. So some people are being quarantined. So if you get the COVID-19 virus, yeah, especially at the start, they were very strict on quarantining. If you had it, you just didn't leave your house for 2 weeks, essentially.
Why is it under 2 weeks? What happens in 2 weeks that is so significant?
Because your body eventually creates antibodies. So it's just like any disease. Your body will eventually make you immune to it. It just takes about 2 weeks for the primary immune response to undergo its whole process to create antibodies.
So it's essentially giving it a head start.
Oh, it's just like any disease. So the primary immune response always takes about 2 weeks. Pretty much for any disease, if you're going to create antibodies, it'll take about 2 weeks to develop. And then once you've done that, in theory, you're immune. There has been some reported cases where it's been weird and some people have been affected again, or they've tested positive again. They're not really sure why. But yeah, generally, if you wait those 2 weeks, if you're quarantined, then you'll be fine. We've looked at different methods by which contagious diseases can spread. Okay. But once we have the understanding of how these things spread or how they can be destroyed, quarantining, before we know now what we know, quarantining really was the only way that they could stop it. And you're right. So back when the bubonic plague was happening, they had no idea what they were doing. They didn't know how it spread. They didn't even know it was, bacterial. They had no idea. But they knew that it seemed to occur that if you come in contact with someone that has it, you get sick. All right, that's a pretty basic concept. So it makes sense that they were quarantining people back in the 1300s. They thought, well, if you're sick, don't come near me, pretty much. Or they would stay away from sick people. And this has been like the real fundamental, easiest strategy throughout all of history. People have always realized, okay, if I touch you, we get sick for some reason. So let's quarantine. Like we said, the Black Plague was a really good example of quarantining. They had no medicines had an effect on the disease. It spread rapidly across sort of all of Europe, killed a hell of a lot of people. And so eventually they set up armed forces to stop infected people from entering cities. And they would pretty much quarantine or isolate their entire city and just say, look, nobody's coming in. Okay. The problem with that was that, well, yeah, it's an issue because, if we think about trade and getting resources, it's easier now because we could send things by plane. Back in the day, it would take weeks to get food and other resources from one place to another. So if you put restrictions on these things because of quarantining, it can have a big issue. And generally, the poorer groups in society got screwed over, right? Nobody cared about them. They were left on the streets. They tended to die. They didn't have good sanitation. They couldn't clean themselves, and so they tended to die pretty quickly. Probably not. I don't. Maybe.
It's apostrophe S or just S.
Yeah, I think so. I don't know. I've done a look. I don't know. That's how I wrote it, but I don't know. Maybe I'm doubting myself now. I'll look it up. I'm not sure. And despite those problems and increases in understanding, we still quarantine. And we're seeing that right now. It's the most fundamental, easy way. Even with all of our, great knowledge and medical history, medical advances, we're still quarantining. If we think about the SARS in 2003, Ebola in 2015, quarantining was still the way. And you're right. That's one of the reasons we contained SARS so quickly, because they acted quickly and they quarantined quickly and they stopped it. Yeah. And, while this is happening, we have a range of different people, epidemiologists, which is their job to study that disease, figure out better ways to actually, stop that spread of disease. And they work with everyone else to actually make this happen. Yeah. So quarantining, so we've got so far, the vector stuff, killing the pathogens, quarantining. And the last, biggest one is sort of the immune response. This is where, why we tend to quarantine is because we can generate our own immunity, but it takes time. We have a lot of our own protections from disease, and obviously immunity is great. We can either have it, through natural or acquired resistance. So vaccines is really important. And obviously, eventually, herd immunity is one of the biggest stops of spread as well. And the development of vaccine is great, but it does take a number of months. And so if we get a pandemic, which is something that we haven't seen before, that spreads quickly, we're not prepared for it, which is what we're seeing now. Let's look at a bit of a case study. So I just wanted to show, so what you're going to have to do in the last sort of assessment in this topic, you got to essentially, general idea is you're going to come up with a disease. You can either use one that has been a disease previously that we know about, or you can make up your own disease. You can come up with a hybrid of a disease. I don't really care, but you got to think about a disease, and you're going to talk about, its spread, the transmission methods, the symptoms, and pretty much you've got to come up with a strategy to prevent the spread of a disease. What would you do? In Australia, how would we go about spreading or stopping the spread of a disease? That's the general idea of the last assignment. Now, we're going to look at a case study. If we think about Ebola, bit of a background, it's this disease caused by a virus. It first appeared in sort of Africa in like 1800s, and it actually appeared near the Ebola River, hence the name Ebola. So it's been around for a very, very long time. They thought that it originated from fruit bats. It's very virulent, highly contagious. It's easily spread. It spreads easily in sort of dense and mobile populations. Before we could sort of come up with any suitable interventions, it spread very quickly. They think about 10,000 people have sort of died from it, potentially. Yeah. How was it spread? So it's spread by sort of contact, person to person, through things like bodily fluid exchange, so breast milk, blood, sharing needles, potentially through sexual contact, so through semen, and possibly incorrect handling of victims of the disease. So if people have died, incorrect handling of the bodies has led to the spread of the disease as well. So we talk about the spread. How did they actually go about controlling Ebola? Well, they thought that some infected man was sort of came from Liberia, traveled to Nigeria, got about 19 other people infected or contracted the disease. The World Health Organization was pretty quick to react. So this is when we're talking about the sort of 2015 spread at this stage. It's been around for a long time, but at that stage, it wasn't really around. All of a sudden, 19 people contracted it. WHO and other authorities contained the spread very quickly. They declared essentially Nigeria Ebola-free after about 42 days of no cases. So it took them that long to, I guess, declare it to be Ebola-free. What did they do in that time? First thing was really that early diagnosis and quarantining was the initial thing, right? So as soon as you see a spread of a disease, so something like Ebola, all of a sudden you've got 20 people that have got this disease, okay? Figure out first that it's Ebola really quickly and quarantine the individuals, okay? You want to make sure that you handle the patients that are infected adequately, so full protective clothing for healthcare workers, because they don't want to come in contact with infected patients. That's going to spread. They educated and created awareness strategies for the local population. Okay, so they told them, well, if somebody dies, how do you adequately bury the dead? You don't want to catch it from someone. You can still catch a disease from someone who's dead. The virus isn't going to magically go away, so you have to bury them. Because you got to remember, in places like Africa and that, they have their own rituals. They have their own burial rituals, which might not be very safe, and they have their own health practices, and they have a whole range of weird things. So to actually educate them and make them aware that what you're doing isn't safe was a really big thing that they did. Okay, they educated people about the risks of eating wildlife that might have been infected. Again, you think about somewhere like Nigeria, they eat a lot of wild animals. That's just what they do. They capture their animals and they eat them, right? If you have infected animals, it can be an easy way to spread disease quite quickly. We saw that in China. The theory is potentially that somebody ate some infected animals. Maybe they're not really sure. Again, protective practices. So if you are handling wildlife, wear gloves. Good sanitation. So they increase the sanitation standards in that area. They fast track sort of vaccines, so that's one way that we could sort of control disease as well. But these are sort of those 4 or 5 things that they did really, really well, which really stopped the spread of this particular disease really, really quickly. So again, early diagnosis, quarantining, making sure people that are dealing with infected patients are adequately protected. Make sure the general population is aware of how it's spread and what are some strategies to avoid it. Making sure they're aware that wildlife may be infected, and make sure sanitation is good. These are all ways that they stop this spread really, really quickly. Sometimes you've got to be aware there are ethical considerations, and this is what people are cracking up about now a little bit, which I don't agree with. But in America, there are a lot of people protesting that they're essentially being held against their will in at home, and they want to stop these. They want to stop all of this isolation stuff. They're pretty much saying that we're invading their sort of civil liberties, potentially. I don't know. It is what it is. You got to make sure, treatment costs can be very high. So ethically, we're going to be careful about how much the treatments cost. And you're going to make sure that, there should be medication available for critically ill patients, especially in poorer countries. You've got to be aware that there are dangers to sort of healthcare workers. So that's, some sort of ethical consideration. Healthcare workers return to their home countries that, they need quarantining. So there's a whole range of different ethical considerations when we talk about, disease as well. It's not as easy as just saying, look, let's quarantine everyone and let the healthcare workers go and work on them. There are things that we need to take into consideration. And that's pretty much all I've got for the moment. Yeah. Yes, in terms of like forcing people to have vaccines and things, or what do you? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, no, I agree with. Yeah, and you're right. And we saw in that pandemic series we've been watching, they actually showed, was it I think it was in Africa as well, where they had all those sort of health tents set up and they were trying to treat people. But you're right, the fact that they were not adequately educated as to why they were there and what they were doing, that these people started like burning down the tents that they had set up because they just didn't know necessarily enough about it. And you're right, it can be very scary. You're right. Imagine these people coming into your country and essentially taking over, and it must look very scary. Yeah, that's against Yeah, yeah, potentially. So it might come down to a cost thing. So like they might not have the money for vaccines and stuff. So they might have to prioritize where the vaccines go. It must be it's a very scary. It must be a very scary thing. And you're right. And then a lot of you think about a lot of those countries have their own religious beliefs. They have their own cultural beliefs, and you're coming in and telling them to change their ways. And okay, you can't bury someone like this, but their belief is that if you don't do that, they're not going to go to their afterlife or whatever it is. It must be a very confronting thing. So you do have to take these things into consideration, So yeah, it can be a scary thing. I agree. It must be. All right. So let me stop this.